Hey there and welcome back. This is Felix from Goldammer Vintage Watches. In watches, the dial is often one of the most beautiful and eye-catching parts of the watch. But what makes the face of a watch so special? Well, one of the most important aspects is the color. From deep, rich blacks to shimmering blue and silver up to bright whites. Vintage watch dials come in all sorts of colors, each with its own unique history and significance. We believe that the smallest details can provide new insights into the history of watchmaking if we only allow ourselves to look more closely. So, whether you're a collector or just appreciate the art of vintage watchmaking, please allow yourself to follow us down the rabbit hole of dial colors. True design is never random. Behind every detail, there's a plan and a bigger picture. A vision that floats from someone's mind to a drawing board and ultimately to our wrists. No element, however insignificant it may seem, is simply there. And the very same applies to the dial color of a watch. It too is subject to several factors ranging from contemporary trends to usage and finishing techniques. To better understand what colors can tell us about the world of watches in the last century, our article writer Markus has once again quantitatively assessed the distribution of dial colors. Look at this stunning Omega constellation, for example, from the 1960s. Gold dials doesn't necessarily have to be flashy. In many cases, it perfectly blends into the overall design, easing the contrast. So there's much more color can tell us about a design. So let's start our today's journey with the brightest and at the same time the most discreet color, white. As you can see on this IWC from 1960, it gives the cleanest and unexcited look to any dial. But how many dials were white in percentage terms in the last century? Which types of watches were particularly often equipped with white dials and which less so? Now let your eyes wander over this graph. Here you can see the historical distribution of white dial popularity from 1940 to 2000 in the form of a black line, with special attention to dress watches with a green dashed line. On the right side, you can see the distribution of white dials on different types of watches, like diver, dress casual, chrono, and military. Not surprisingly, we see that in this 60 years, over half of all dress watches with 53% and over 30% of all chronographs and dress casual pieces come in white. It is also the color of the 1950s. Peaking in 1952, white dials are by far the most popular choice of the decade, highlighting the admiration of dress watches during those years in general. However, looking into the relative numbers, within the dress watch category, we still see that the 1950s with over 60% favor this color, over let's say the 1970s with below 30%. Quite surprisingly though, or maybe not for everyone, white is the dress watch color of the 1990s neo-vintage era with over 70% of all dress watches. The next color we would like to look at in more detail is silver. During the 1960s and 70s, the silver dial was a chic and clean alternative to plain white. If white is the color of the 1950s and 90s, silver dials fall right in the middle from 1960 up to the 1980s with around 35% of all produced watches. Considering that we have passed through the space age era, silver is not an unusual choice. On top, we'd also see that the style during that era generally was a lot more casual. The distribution of silver dials clearly follows that of the dress casual watches. The third of all today's color schemes is one of the most appealing: blue. Say what you want, but blue is a modern color. It virtually didn't exist in the watch landscape prior to 1960 and wasn't really used until Patek Philippe introduced their lips and gave this color a royal touch to it. Here again, you can see the historical distribution of blue dial popularity from 1940 to 2000, highlighting dive watches in a green dashed line. As we can clearly see, it is mainly a color for utility-oriented watches like divers with 10%, dress casual watches with 9%, and sports watches with 7% market share. So this color made quite the transition from the ultimate elegant to the forefront of tool watches. This is further underlined by the usage in dive watches. Blue in general peaks in the late 1970s, but that peak comes from dress casual watches. Later, we actually see that dive watches are the major source for blue dials, a color that has been reimagined at least 3 times over the last 60 years. The next dial color is gold. Golden dials might be a little flashy for some, but to others it's the ultimate elegance. And you have to admit, a golden dial on a gold watch blends right in and adds a lot of subtlety to the overall design. So a golden dial doesn't always have to be loud. Consequently, you can see this color mainly on dress casual watches with 18%, dress watches with 16%, and chronographs with 6%. If we take a closer look at the historical distribution of golden dials, one thing that is evident is that this color does not have a particular peak in history, nor does it plateau at some point. It rather waxes and wanes through the 20th century. In the early 1980s, dress watches apparently had to have a little extra bling. In numbers, that means that over 50% of those dress watches came with a golden dial. Last but not least, we take a closer look at black dials. From all different colors discussed in this video, black is the most common one. Black dials have a market share of 40% from the mid-1960s onwards. There's simply that little post-war dip during the 1950s that black dials are hard to come by. But it's not only the classic and timeless elegance that made black the ultimate dial color. It's the utility color. If you want to watch with a certain function, legibility becomes a major factor. And black simply gave you that in any condition. Underwater, in the night, camouflaged in trenches, you name it. Thus, over 90% of all military watches, 87% of all dive watches, about 60% of all sports watches, and a good 40% of all chronographs feature black dials. You see, as utilitarian as this color is, it again can nicely show us transition in design languages. Over time, these pieces became more of a fashion statement, and it wasn't necessarily to have ultra-large lamp plots against a black dial. And so other colors became more prevalent. As you can see, and we hopefully shown you, dial colors are all but random. Through history, we can observe several shifts in design archetypes simply by looking at the dial color. We can see that colors can display the contemporary taste of certain watch types. For dress watches, for example, we see white as the color of the 1950s and the neo-vintage era, but for golden are the late 1970s and early 1980s. Next, colors can be completely associated with certain watch types and thus follow their popularity. A perfect example are silver dials, which are tightly linked to dress casual pieces. Even if a color seems to stagnate in popularity, it does not mean that its ratio between watch types does not change. This can be seen very well in blue dials. These are closely associated with dress casual watches in the 1970s, but become more popular with dive watches in the 1990s. However, this is not visible from the historical distribution. So, we hope you enjoyed this brief look at dial colors, and the next time you hold a watch in your hand and look at the dial, you realize that color is not just a small detail, but it can say a lot about the watch. So have a great day and hope to see you in our next video.